My mother tried everything to exclude me from their Japan trip because her new family likes me more than her. Now she's getting a taste of her own medicine. My mom, Linda, married Frank when I was 17, and I gained 2 stepbrothers, Tom, who was 16, and Bobby, who was 14. Frank worked in finance and had this beautiful house with a pool and a game room in the basement. The weird thing was Frank and the boys actually liked me from day one. Frank would ask about my day at school and really listen. Tom and Bobby included me in everything, like I'd always been their sister. We'd play basketball in the driveway, and Frank would join us after work. Linda would watch from the window looking annoyed. At first I thought she was just adjusting to the blended family thing, but it got worse. When Frank bought me a phone for my birthday just like he bought the boys, Linda said I was taking advantage of his generosity. When Tom asked me to teach him guitar, Linda said I was showing off. When Bobby wanted me to help with his science project instead of her, she accused me of trying to replace her. Frank noticed Linda being cold to me and asked her about it. She said I was having trouble accepting her happiness and needed time. That was a complete lie, but Frank trusted his new wife. The boys kept inviting me to stuff, and Linda kept making excuses why I couldn't go. She'd suddenly remember I had chores when they went to the movies. She'd say I was grounded for something tiny when Frank took them to baseball games. She'd claim I was sick when they went out to dinner. I'd find out later when the boys asked why I didn't come. The Japan trip was Frank's idea for our first family vacation. He announced it at dinner, and the boys started planning everything we'd do together. Linda smiled and said it would be perfect for the 4 of them. Frank corrected her and said 5, all of us. Linda's face twitched, but she agreed. For 3 months, we planned as a family. I learned basic Japanese phrases to teach Bobby. Tom and I researched places to eat since we both loved trying new food. Frank let me help book hotels since I was good at finding deals. Linda just watched and said nothing. 2 weeks before the trip, Linda told me I wasn't going. She said Frank's mom was sick and someone needed to stay with her. This was news to me since Frank's mom lived in Arizona and we lived in Ohio. Linda said she was flying in and needed care. I asked Frank about his mom, and he said she was perfectly healthy and had a cruise that week. Linda turned red and said I must have misunderstood. The next day, Linda tried again. She told me the airline called and said they overbooked. She said my ticket got canceled and there were no more seats. I called the airline myself. They said all 5 tickets were confirmed. Linda grabbed the phone and hung up saying I was bothering them. 3 days before the trip, Linda told Frank I'd decided to stay home to focus on college applications. Frank found that suspicious since I was a junior and had another year. He asked me directly, and I said Linda told me I couldn't go. Linda jumped in saying I was confused and emotional about them leaving. Frank looked between us and said we'd discuss it later. That night I heard them arguing. Frank said he paid for 5 tickets and 5 people were going. Linda said I'd ruined the trip with my bad attitude. Frank asked what bad attitude since I'd been nothing but excited. Linda couldn't answer. The morning of the flight, Linda told me the taxi was full and I'd have to meet them at the airport. Then she gave me the wrong terminal number. When I got to Terminal A, they weren't there. I called Tom and he said they were at Terminal C and boarding was starting. I ran across the airport and made it just as they were about to close the gate. Linda looked shocked to see me. She actually asked the gate agent if my ticket was real. Frank told her to stop making a scene and get on the plane. On the plane, Linda tried to sit next to me, but Tom and Bobby had already claimed the seats. She had to sit alone 2 rows back. The boys spent the flight teaching me card games, and Frank joined us while Linda sat by herself sulking. In Tokyo, Linda tried to control everything. She'd say we were going one place, then get upset when Frank took us somewhere else from our planned list. She'd try to split us up for activities, but the boys wanted to stick together. She suggested I was old enough to explore alone, but Frank said we stayed as a family. When Linda tried to book separate rooms at the hotel, Frank found out and made her cancel. She had to explain to the desk clerk why she'd tried to change a reservation secretly. At the robot restaurant, Linda told the host we were a party of 4. I held up my ticket and said 5. The host looked confused and Linda claimed she had forgotten me. Tom said loudly that she'd been forgetting his sister all week. People stared, and Linda went red. She spent the rest of the show in silence while we cheered and took pictures. The temple visit was the worst for Linda. The guide spoke English, but I'd been practicing Japanese greetings. When I bowed and said thank you properly, the guide complimented Frank on raising such a respectful daughter. That's when my mother lost it. Linda's face went bright red and her voice got loud enough that other tourists turned to stare at us. She started saying that I wasn't really Frank's daughter, and the guide made a mistake. Frank put his hand on her shoulder and told her firmly that I was his daughter in every way that mattered. The temple guide shifted from foot to foot and looked uncomfortable as Linda kept going. She insisted that I was just a stepdaughter and shouldn't be praised like I was really part of the family. Tom stepped between Linda and the guide and told her that she was embarrassing everyone and needed to calm down right now. His voice was sharp and I'd never heard him talk to her like that before. Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Frank apologized to the guide in halting Japanese that sounded rough and wrong, but the guide nodded and smiled a little. Frank took Linda's arm and led her away from the group toward a quiet corner of the temple grounds near some stone benches. Bobby stayed close to me and whispered that his mom had been acting crazy this whole trip. He said he was glad someone finally called her out on treating me badly. I watched Frank and Linda near a stone lantern and could see them having an intense conversation. Linda gestured wildly with her hands, and her face was still red. Frank's posture got stiffer and more rigid with his arms crossed over his chest. The guide asked if we'd like to continue the tour, and Tom said yes. He said we'd catch up with our parents later because we wanted to hear about the temple's history. The guide seemed relieved to focus on the three of us without the family drama. She led us down a stone path toward the main building and started explaining how old everything was. I practiced more Japanese phrases with Bobby and tried to remember the ones I'd been teaching him on the plane. The guide complimented my pronunciation and said I had a good ear for the language. That made me feel proud despite the awful scene Linda just caused. Bobby pointed at different statues and asked questions about what they meant. Tom took pictures with his phone and made jokes about how we'd remember this trip forever. When we finished the tour and met back up with Frank and Linda near the entrance, my mother's eyes were red like she'd been crying. Her face was set in this tight, angry expression with her jaw clenched. Frank thanked the guide again and pulled out some bills to tip her. The guide bowed and thanked him and gave me a small smile before she left. Frank said we were heading back to the hotel because we all needed to talk as a family. The taxi ride back was completely silent except for Bobby trying to make small talk about what we saw at the temple. He talked about the statues and the gardens and how cool the architecture was. Linda stared out the window, refusing to look at any of us. Frank kept glancing at her with this disappointed expression I'd never seen him wear before. His mouth was pressed into a thin line and his hands were folded in his lap. Tom sat next to me in the back seat and our shoulders touched. At the hotel, Frank asked Tom and Bobby to give us an hour alone in his and Linda's room. The boys both hugged me before they left. Tom whispered that whatever happened, they were on my side. He said nothing. Linda said would change how they felt about me. Bobby squeezed my hand and told me it would be okay. The door closed behind them and suddenly the room felt too small and too quiet. In the hotel room, Frank sat Linda and me down on opposite ends of the bed. He pulled a chair from the desk and sat facing us. He said we were going to have an honest conversation about what had been happening since he married Linda. Linda jumped in right away and said I was too sensitive. She said she'd been nothing but welcoming and I was making problems out of nothing. Frank held up his hand and cut her off. He started listing specific examples of her behavior that excluded me. He brought up the fake grandmother illness and how he'd called his mom to check on her. He mentioned the airline ticket lie and how he'd confirmed all 5 tickets were valid. He talked about the wrong terminal number and how I'd almost missed the flight. He listed every attempt Linda made to keep me from this trip. Linda's face went pale as he kept talking. Her hands started shaking in her lap and she wouldn't look at either of us. I started talking, and once I began, I couldn't stop. I told Frank about the time Linda said I was grounded when really the boys wanted me to go to a baseball game with them. I told him about how she'd claim I was sick when they went out for pizza. I told him about every movie I missed because Linda suddenly remembered chores I needed to finish. My voice got stronger as I listed each excuse she'd made to keep me away from them. Linda opened her mouth to interrupt, but Frank held up his hand without looking at her. He kept his eyes on me and told her she'd get her turn after I finished. I kept going and told him about the phone calls to my room saying dinner was canceled when really they were eating without me. I told him about the times she'd give me the wrong address for Bobby's soccer games so I'd show up at empty fields. Linda's face went from red to pale as I kept talking. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she looked like she wanted to disappear into the hotel bed. When I finally stopped talking, the room was so quiet I could hear people walking past our door in the hallway. Frank turned to Linda and asked if she had anything to say. Linda's face crumpled and tears started running down her cheeks. She said she'd been jealous of how easy everything was for me with Frank and the boys. She said Tom and Bobby treated me like a real sister from day one, but she still felt like an outsider after 2 years of marriage. Her voice broke when she said it wasn't fair that I got Frank's attention and the boys' love when she was the one who married into this family. She said she was supposed to be the center of their world, but instead they all acted like I was the missing piece they'd been waiting for. Frank's voice came out cold and flat in a way I'd never heard before. He told Linda that she married into his family, but I was invited in by all 3 of them separately. He said I earned their love by being kind and genuine and caring about them as people. He said Linda's jealousy was her problem to fix and not mine to solve by making myself smaller. Linda cried harder and her whole body shook. She said she never meant to hurt me and just wanted to feel like she belonged. She said it seemed like there wasn't enough room for both of us in the family. Frank's jaw clenched and he told her that was a lie she created in her own head. He said her jealousy damaged her relationship with me and with him. He said when we got home, Linda needed to start seeing a therapist about her issues. He said we all needed family therapy to fix what she broke. Linda nodded but kept her eyes on the floor and wouldn't look at me. I realized right then that she wasn't really sorry. She knew her behavior was wrong, but she still hated that Frank and the boys loved me. Frank turned to me and asked if I wanted to keep going on this trip or fly home early. He said whatever I chose, he and the boys would support me completely. I thought about all the planning Tom and I did for restaurants. I thought about the Japanese phrases I taught Bobby. I thought about how excited I'd been for 3 months. I told Frank I wanted to stay because I wasn't letting Linda's problems ruin something I'd looked forward to for so long. Frank nodded and told Linda she needed to treat me with basic respect for the rest of the trip. He said if she couldn't manage that, she'd be the one going home early instead of me. Linda whispered that she understood. Frank got up and opened the door to call the boys back in. Tom and Bobby came in looking worried and Frank sat them down. He explained that we'd talked through some issues and we were finishing the vacation as a family. Tom asked if everything was okay, and Frank said it would be. Bobby looked at Linda's red eyes and then at me. He came over and hugged me tight without saying anything. That evening we went to a restaurant near the hotel. Linda sat across from me and barely spoke during the whole meal. She ordered food and ate it but kept her eyes on her plate. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut. Tom tried making jokes about the robot restaurant and how wild the show had been. He did impressions of the robots and got Bobby laughing. Bobby pulled out his phone and showed us pictures from the temple. He had shots of the gardens and the statues and one really good one of the main building. Frank looked at each picture and asked Bobby questions about what he'd learned. Linda just nodded when anyone spoke to her directly. The waiter brought our food and I focused on eating. The sushi was amazing, but I couldn't really enjoy it with Linda sitting there looking miserable. Tom kept the conversation going by talking about what we should do tomorrow. He mentioned the Japanese garden we'd planned to visit. Bobby said he wanted to see the koi fish there. Frank agreed and said we'd go first thing in the morning. The next day we took a taxi to the garden. Linda sat in the front seat and didn't say much during the drive. When we got there, she walked next to me instead of trailing behind like usual. She pointed at a map near the entrance and asked if I wanted to see the tea house first. Her voice sounded stiff like she was reading from a script. I said sure, and we all headed that direction. The garden was beautiful with perfectly trimmed trees and stone paths winding between ponds. Bobby ran ahead to look at the koi fish. Tom took pictures of everything. Linda stayed close and made comments about the plants we passed. She asked me what I thought about the bridge over the main pond. I said it was pretty, and she agreed. Everything felt forced and awkward. She was including me because Frank told her to, and not because she actually wanted me there. At the tea house, we sat on the floor, and a woman in a kimono served us tea. Linda sat between me and Bobby. She asked me if I'd tried green tea before. I said yes at home, and she nodded. The conversation died, and we drank our tea in silence. Tom made a face at the bitter taste, and Bobby laughed at him. Frank smiled, and the tension broke a little bit. We walked through the rest of the garden, and Linda kept making an effort. She'd point things out to me or ask my opinion about which path to take. It all felt like an act, but at least she wasn't pretending I didn't exist anymore. For lunch, Tom and I had picked out a sushi place we'd been excited about. We'd spent hours looking at the menu online and planning what to order. When we sat down, Linda looked at her menu and then at me. She asked what I recommended since I'd studied everything beforehand. I was surprised she remembered that. I suggested the salmon set and the tuna rolls. I told her about the special sauce they made and how good the reviews said it was. Linda ordered exactly what I suggested. When the food came, she tried everything and then looked at me. She said the salmon was really good and thanked me for the recommendation. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge after everything. Tom grinned at me across the table. Bobby asked me to help him order dessert. Frank watched Linda and me with this careful expression like he was making sure she kept her word. The rest of lunch was easier. Linda didn't talk much, but when she did speak, she was included me naturally. She asked about my favorite parts of the trip so far. She listened when I answered. It still felt like she was following rules Frank set instead of genuinely caring, but it was better than her trying to erase me from the family. That evening, Bobby brought up the anime store he'd found online. He showed us pictures of the merchandise on his phone and looked at Linda like he expected her to say no. She glanced at the photos and then at Frank before nodding and saying we could go tomorrow morning. Bobby's face lit up and he started talking about all the things he wanted to look at. Tom said he'd been wanting to check out Japanese manga stores too. I was surprised Linda agreed without making excuses or suggesting the boys go without me. The next morning, we took the train to Akihabara and found the store Bobby had researched. It was huge with multiple floors of anime figures, manga, and merchandise I'd never seen before. Bobby ran ahead, pulling Tom with him, and I followed close behind. Linda walked in last and stood near the entrance watching us. We spent almost 2 hours looking at everything. Bobby found figures from his favorite shows and kept showing them to me, asking if I thought they were cool. Tom discovered a whole section of manga he couldn't get back home and started making a list of what to buy. I found some Studio Ghibli merchandise, and Linda actually walked over to look at what I was holding. She asked if I liked those movies, and I said they were my favorite. She picked up a small Totoro keychain and looked at it for a minute before putting it back down. She didn't complain once about how long we were taking or try to rush us out. She just stood there quiet and patient while the three of us got excited over everything we found. When we finally left the store, Bobby was carrying 2 full bags and thanking everyone for letting him take so much time there. Our last full day in Japan, we drove to Mount Fuji, The weather was perfect and the mountain looked amazing against the blue sky. Frank wanted to take a family photo with the mountain behind us. He asked another tourist to take the picture and we all lined up. Linda stood on one side of me instead of positioning herself at the opposite end like she usually did. Tom was on my other side and Bobby stood in front of us. Frank stood next to Linda and put his arm around her shoulder. The tourist counted to 3 and took several shots. Linda's smile looked forced and uncomfortable, but at least she was trying to look like she wanted to be there. Frank thanked the tourist and we looked at the photos together. In every picture, Linda was standing right next to me, making it look like we were actually a family unit instead of 4 people plus 1 outsider. Bobby said we should print the photo and frame it when we got home. Linda didn't object or suggest taking another one without me. We walked around the visitor center and looked at the exhibits about the mountain's history. Linda stayed with the group the whole time and even made a few comments about what we were seeing. It still felt awkward and forced, like she was following Frank's rules instead of genuinely wanting to include me, but it was better than her actively trying to erase me from everything. The flight home the next day was long but less tense than I expected. Linda took a window seat and put in earbuds almost immediately. She closed her eyes and seemed to fall asleep within the first hour. Tom and Bobby sat in the row with me and we picked out movies to watch together. Bobby wanted to watch something funny, and Tom found an action movie we all agreed on. Frank sat next to Linda but kept leaning into the aisle to check on us. He'd ask if we needed anything or if we were comfortable. I could tell he was watching to make sure Linda didn't try anything else now that we were heading back to reality. She slept through most of the flight, and when she was awake, she just stared out the window or scrolled through her phone. She didn't try to talk to any of us or make comments about the trip. The boys and I talked quietly about our favorite parts of Japan and what we wanted to do when we got home. Tom said he wanted to learn more Japanese and maybe take a class at the school. Bobby said he wanted to go back someday and see more cities. I agreed and said I'd love to visit Osaka next time. Linda turned her head slightly when I said that, like she was listening, but she didn't say anything. When we got home and unpacked, Frank told Linda to sit down in the living room because they needed to talk. He pulled out his phone and started looking up family therapists in our area. Linda watched him with this unhappy expression, but she didn't argue or make excuses. Frank found someone named Catherine Flynn, who had good reviews and specialized in blended family issues. He called and made an appointment for the following week. Linda said she didn't think therapy was necessary and they could work things out themselves. Frank looked at her and said this wasn't optional if she wanted their marriage to continue. His voice was calm but firm, and Linda's face went pale. She nodded and said she'd go. Frank scheduled the appointment for all 5 of us and wrote it on the calendar in the kitchen. Tom and Bobby came downstairs and asked what was happening. Frank explained we'd be going to family therapy to work through some issues. Tom looked at Linda and said it was about time someone made her face what she'd been doing. Linda opened her mouth like she wanted to respond, but closed it again and looked down at her hands. The first therapy session was in a small office with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Catherine Flynn was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She asked us each to introduce ourselves and then said she wanted to hear from everyone about their experience of the blended family. Linda went first and started talking about how hard it was to blend 2 families together. She said she'd felt excluded from Frank and the boys' relationship, and like she was always on the outside looking in. She talked about how I seemed to fit in so easily while she struggled to find her place. Tom interrupted her mid-sentence and said that wasn't true at all. He listed specific examples of how Linda had actively excluded me from family activities. He brought up the times she'd said I was grounded when I wasn't, and the times she'd claimed I was sick when the boys wanted me to come along. Bobby added that Linda had tried to keep me from coming to Japan with multiple lies. Frank backed them up and told Catherine about the fake grandmother story and the wrong terminal number. Linda's face turned red and she tried to defend herself, but Catherine held up her hand and asked her to listen to what her family was saying. Catherine looked at Linda and said that from what she was hearing, Linda's jealousy stemmed from her own feelings about herself, rather than anything I actually did. She asked Linda to think about why she felt threatened by a teenage girl, instead of embracing her as part of the family. Linda was quiet for a long time before answering. She said she'd always had trouble when other people got attention she thought should be hers. She talked about growing up with a sister who was prettier and more popular, and how their parents always seemed to favor her. She said when she married Frank and saw how easily his sons accepted me, it brought back all those old feelings of not being good enough. Catherine nodded and said that made sense, but pointed out that Linda had taken those feelings out on me instead of dealing with them herself. She asked Linda if she could see how her behavior had hurt me and damaged her relationship with her own family. Linda nodded slowly and wiped her eyes, but she still wouldn't look at me directly. Over the next few weeks, we went to therapy every Wednesday after school. Linda started acknowledging specific things she'd done to exclude me. She admitted lying about the airline tickets and giving me the wrong terminal number. She talked about the times she'd made up excuses to keep me from family activities. She said she'd been jealous of how much Frank and the boys liked me, and it made her feel like she was losing her family to me. Catherine asked her to think about why she saw it as losing instead of gaining. Linda struggled with that question and didn't have a good answer. She still didn't fully apologize or take complete responsibility for everything, but she stopped making excuses. She stopped saying I was too likable or too present. She stopped blaming me for her feelings. Tom and Bobby watched her carefully during these sessions and called her out if she tried to backtrack or minimize what she'd done. Frank stayed quiet most of the time, but his presence felt protective, like he was making sure Linda couldn't twist the narrative again. Frank started being more careful about family time after that. He made sure to include me in everything and shut down any attempts by Linda to create separate activities. When he took the boys to a basketball game, he made Linda come too and sit with all of us instead of letting her stay home. When Linda suggested the boys might want to do something just with her, Frank said we did things as a family now. He planned dinners where we all had to be present and movie nights where everyone participated. Linda looked frustrated sometimes, but she went along with it. She couldn't argue without making herself look worse. Tom and Bobby became even more protective of me after seeing everything their mom had done. If Linda said anything that sounded like she was trying to exclude me, they called her out immediately. Bobby told her once at dinner that she needed to stop being weird about having me around. Tom said if she couldn't handle me being part of the family, then maybe she should think about why that was her problem and not mine. Linda's face went tight, but she didn't respond. She knew her own sons were on my side, and arguing with them would only make things worse. Linda started individual therapy on top of the family sessions. She'd come home on Thursday evenings looking exhausted and emotional. Sometimes her eyes would be red, like she'd been crying. Frank told me privately one night that her therapist was making her deal with deep issues about her self-worth and how she competed with other women. He said it was hard work, but necessary if Linda wanted to have healthy relationships with anyone. He said her therapist was helping her understand that love wasn't a limited resource, and that Frank and the boys loving me didn't mean there was less love for her. I asked Frank if he thought Linda would ever really change, or if this was just temporary because he'd forced her into therapy. Frank said he honestly didn't know, but he was going to make sure she kept trying, because he wouldn't let her treat me badly anymore. About a month after we got back from Japan, Frank called everyone to the dinner table for what he said was going to be a family meeting. I sat down between Tom and Bobby like usual, and Linda took her spot across from me. Frank served the pasta he'd made, and for the first few minutes we just ate in silence. Then Linda put down her fork and looked directly at me. She asked what my plans were for college and which schools I was thinking about applying to. I waited for her to interrupt or change the subject like she always did, but she just sat there listening. I told her about 3 universities I liked, 1 in state and 2 out of state, and explained why each one interested me. Linda nodded and asked follow-up questions about the programs and whether I'd visited any campuses yet. It was such a small thing, having my own mother actually listen to me talk about my future, but it felt huge compared to how she used to pretend I didn't exist. Frank smiled at both of us, and Tom kicked my foot under the table in this encouraging way. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I kept thinking about how Linda had asked me a real question, and waited for my real answer. A few weeks later, Bobby announced that his birthday was coming up and he wanted to have a party at the house. Linda immediately started planning, talking about decorations and food, but Bobby interrupted her. He said he wanted me to help him plan the party because we liked the same music and games. Linda's face did this thing where her smile froze for just a second, and I saw the hurt flash across her eyes. But then she took a breath and said that sounded great, and she'd handle all the food while Bobby and I worked on the entertainment. I caught Frank watching Linda carefully, probably making sure she didn't try to take over or push me out. Bobby and I spent the next week making playlists and planning which games to set up in the basement. Linda asked us questions about what we were planning and gave suggestions, but she didn't try to control everything like she would have before. When Bobby's birthday arrived, the house filled up with his friends from the school. Linda had made tons of food, and everything Bobby and I planned worked perfectly. The music was exactly what everyone wanted to hear, and the game tournament in the basement got super competitive. I was refilling the snack bowls when I heard a group of Bobby's friends talking near the kitchen. One of them said he wished his older sister was as cool as me, and another one agreed, saying their siblings never wanted to hang out with them or help plan stuff. Linda was standing right there by the counter, and I saw her whole body tense up. Her face got tight and her jaw clenched, and for a second I thought she was going to say something mean or leave the room. But instead she closed her eyes, took this really deep breath, and just kept arranging cookies on a plate. She didn't make any comments or give me dirty looks or do anything to ruin Bobby's party. Later that week at our therapy session, I mentioned what happened, and Catherine said that Linda's ability to stop herself from reacting negatively showed real progress in managing her jealousy. Linda didn't look happy about being praised for basic decent behavior, but she nodded and admitted it had been hard to hear Bobby's friends compliment me. The next month, Frank's brother came to visit for the weekend. I'd met him once before at the wedding, but we hadn't really talked. He showed up Friday evening with a bag of gifts for everyone, and within an hour of being in the house, I could tell he was picking up on something weird in how Linda acted around me. He watched her carefully during dinner, noticing how she'd tense up when Frank asked me about school, or when the boys were included me in their conversations. Saturday afternoon, he found me in the game room and asked if we could talk privately. He told me Frank had filled him in on everything that happened in Japan and how Linda had tried so hard to exclude me from the trip. He said he was really proud of how I'd handled the whole situation with maturity and grace, especially since it was my own mother treating me that way. He said most kids would have caused drama or fought back, but I just kept being myself and let Linda's behavior speak for itself. It felt good to have an adult outside our immediate family validate what I'd been through, someone who could see the situation clearly without being caught up in it every day. That same evening, I was upstairs getting ready for bed when I heard voices coming from Frank's office downstairs. The door was partly open and I recognized Frank and his brother talking. I knew I shouldn't listen, but I couldn't help pausing at the top of the stairs. Frank's brother was telling him about a conversation he'd had with Linda earlier that day. He said he'd reminded Linda how lucky she was to have married into a family where everyone had been willing to accept her from day one, no questions asked. He told her that Frank and his sons had opened their home and their hearts to her, and she'd almost destroyed all of that by refusing to extend the same acceptance to me. He said Linda needed to understand that her jealousy wasn't just hurting me, it was damaging her relationships with Frank and her own sons. Frank's voice sounded grateful and a little emotional when he thanked his brother for talking to Linda. He said it helped to have someone else tell her these things, someone she couldn't dismiss as being biased or taking sides. I went to my room feeling like maybe Linda was finally starting to understand what she'd been doing to our family. When October came around, Tom suggested we do a family costume theme for trick-or-treating with Bobby. He threw out a few ideas at dinner, and surprisingly, Linda agreed right away. She even helped us brainstorm costume ideas and went shopping with us to find the pieces we needed. I could tell she was doing it more to make Frank and the boys happy than because she actually wanted to include me, but at least she was making the effort. We ended up going as characters from this old movie Frank loved, and Linda got really into finding the perfect accessories for everyone's costumes. The night of trick-or-treating, we all got dressed up and headed out into the neighborhood. Bobby was excited because this was the first year he got to go out later with the older kids instead of doing the early trick or treating for little kids. We walked from the house to the house, and Bobby's candy bag got heavier and heavier. At one house, a neighbor we'd seen around but didn't really know opened the door and immediately started gushing about our costumes. She said it was so lovely to see a family that got along so well, and that it was especially nice to see a step-family where everyone seemed to genuinely like each other. Linda's smile got really tight and forced, and I could see the muscles in her neck tense up. But she didn't say anything to contradict the neighbor or make some comment about me not really being part of the family.